As we begin, just wanted to take a minute or two to acknowledge that there are a significant number of hardships that are affecting many in our community and honestly in the world. We are obviously in the middle of a pandemic. Folks are juggling homeschooling and working from home. The wildfires battle continues with recent fires in Southern California. There's lots of conversations that are not easy around social justice reform and reevaluating our systems and processes in place. And obviously we have the election. So we wanted to send our deepest gratitude to thank you for making not only the mental space, but the space in your calendar during this extraordinarily challenging time for pretty much everybody. So thank you, thank you. We're really looking forward to today's discussion and hearing from all of you. As I mentioned before, there is a poll that should be showing on your screen. It is anonymous. We are not collecting any personal information, and we would appreciate it if you would complete the 2 questions asked, just so that we can get to know who's joining us. We wish we were together in person, all in one room, so that we could interact a bit more. Obviously we can't, and so the poll can help us to understand who we're talking to today and help to modify the conversation to meet the background and the needs of all of us, of all of you. One more time, any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, please email us at halibut@oceansciencetrust.org or send a message via the chat and we will help to work out those technical kinks. Okay, next slide, please. And I should acknowledge that there is a delay in the slides, so thank you for your patience. Okay, so Strategic Earth has been contracted by the California Ocean Science Trust to help design and to facilitate today's webinar. We will also be leading the development of a webinar summary report that I'll speak to as we close the webinar. As neutral facilitators, my colleague and I, Sarah Finstad, are committed to upholding an inclusive, transparent, and productive dialogue today, and well, all the days that we work. So if you have any questions or concerns about how we're facilitating today's conversation and supporting this effort, please contact us directly at hello@strategicearth.com. And we will drop that into the chat so that you have the email. So the poll and survey results are anonymous. Again, we appreciate you completing these. The poll gets us, helps us to get to know who we are talking to today. And the survey that will be available at the close of the webinar will really be your opportunity to share your experience about today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and closed captions are available. The recording and a transcript of the closed captions will be posted to the Ocean Science Trust website following the webinar. Closed captions are available by clicking on the CC within Zoom. It's at the bottom right, and you will need to click Enable Subtitles or Show Subtitles. We understand that some folks who are on Zoom in the browser may not have access to CC, closed caption, and so just again, we will be making a transcript of the webinar available to the public. All participants are muted and will remain on mute throughout the duration of the webinar to eliminate background noise. We do have 2 Q&A sessions, and we will open the lines for those Q&A sessions so that we can hear from you directly. And during our first Q&A session, we'll provide more information on how you can unmute yourself and state your question. For the presentations and all other aspects of the webinar, you are on mute just in an effort to eliminate background noise. So thank you for your understanding. Throughout the webinar, we will invite your questions and also your comments. Today, there will be 2 Q&A sessions, Q&A meaning question and answer, but obviously we want to take this opportunity to hear from you about your perspectives, your priorities, your concerns, your sentiments. So please, don't hesitate to send a comment in the Q&A box. On our end, as the project team, we will be reviewing those questions and comments as they come in, and we will select a mix of questions and comments that reflect the diversity of folks on the webinar. We will do our best to read out as many questions as we can and have those addressed by the appropriate person, and also to hear from as many folks as we can while adhering to the timeline within our agenda. And again, we will talk more about how to engage in the Q&A verbally when we get there. To increase transparency, a transcript of all questions and statements that are submitted during the webinar will be made available to the public. Questions and comments will be recorded anonymously unless you choose to include your name and/or your affiliation alongside your question and comment. If you choose to type this information with your statement or your question, then you are giving consent for this information to be shared publicly. Otherwise, all names will be stripped and the transcript will be published anonymously. Materials that were made available to the public in advance of the webinar include today's agenda and the terms of reference document regarding the scientific peer review process. We will share timelines for the stock assessment and the peer review report as part of our next steps discussion at the close of the webinar. And we will be dropping those links to the agenda and the terms of reference into the chat momentarily. Next slide, please. So there are several goals for today's webinar outlined in the agenda and outlined here on your screen. The first is to engage with tribes and Native communities, stakeholders, and the broader ocean community who are interested in learning about and becoming involved in the California halibut fisheries management process. We're hopeful to facilitate more understanding, a deeper understanding by the participants, all of you, of CDFW's current focus on gathering information and assessing the California halibut resource as part of the implementation of the 2018 Marine Life Management Act, MLMA Master Plan for Fisheries. Next slide, please. OST and CDFW are here today to share information about the scope and the findings of the California halibut stock assessment conducted by CDFW and the scientific and technical peer review that was led by Ocean Science Trust. We also will provide an update on next steps to design a science-based, stakeholder-involved management process for the California halibut fishery that reflects the diversity of knowledge and priorities of all of you, our ocean community. And lastly, we would like to facilitate a Q&A with our participants to learn of additional insights, perspectives, and so forth, and address any priority questions and concerns that you may have during this very early stage of gathering information and assessing the California halibut stock. So to complement all of the above, it's our intention that you leave today's webinar with a kind of foundational understanding of the core components and the high-level takeaways of both the stock assessment and the peer review, both process and findings. Today's webinar is about providing the context and the overview so that later in the month, in November, when these reports are available, you can download them and read them, continue your learning, but you'll have that kind of foundational understanding so that they're easier to digest and understand. So today's webinar is really an orientation to this information. Next slide, please. Okay. So here's a brief snapshot of today's webinar agenda. Just wanted to highlight that there are 2 Q&A sessions during the webinar. The overview of the stock assessment and peer review is a presentation followed by a Q&A, and then the building a roadmap for the California halibut fishery management agenda item is also a presentation followed by Q&A. So we're hopeful that the questions and comments will be focused on the agenda topic at hand. And we can always put things in the parking lot if there are questions that are asked that we're going to get to later in the webinar. Also wanted to highlight that the final agenda topic will include the option to complete an anonymous survey. Again, this is your opportunity to share with us what your experience was during today's webinar. And when the webinar ends, you will be directed to the Google Forms survey homepage, I think automatically when you close your browser. Again, it's optional, just sharing the information so that you know it's there. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a good number of folks joining us for today's conversation. So we just wanted to briefly outline the webinar agreement. And we will operate under the assumption that all of you agree to abide by these agreements so we can have a productive and collaborative discussion. And I can always be helpful in reminding folks of webinar agreements if and when they are needed. So the agreements that we are agreeing to are to listen to build mutual understanding, to openly discuss ideas and issues with others and respect the diversity of perspectives that you may hear, to explore ideas where common ground is the goal, to contribute to an inclusive and collaborative environment, to speak openly and honestly. Keep comments concise and focused. Obviously, we're all at home. There's a lot going on. We do ask that you limit distractions and any multitasking so that you could be fully engaged in the discussion. Please do not hesitate to reach out to the project team through the chat with any questions or concerns about the facilitation of the webinar or the webinar process. And lastly, personal attacks and disrespectful behavior will not be tolerated. Okay, so thank you for your patience. It's important that we take the time to convey the meeting design and goals to ensure that we're all on the same page. We'll be here together for 2 hours. So I will now move into our first agenda topic. Next slide, please. Welcome and context. And you can actually advance one more. So during this agenda item, we will have opening remarks from Craig Schumann, the Marine Region Manager of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And following Craig's remarks, there will be a presentation by Kirsten Ramey, the Environmental Program Manager with Marine Region at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So thank you, Craig and Kirsten, for both being here today. And so that Craig knows who he's welcoming, would love for you, Jess, to release the results of the poll so we can see who's joined us. Fantastic. Okay, so based on the poll results, almost a third evenly of folks have identified as residing or working in Northern California, Central California, and Southern California. So that's pretty even there. Outside California, looks like we have 6%, so within the West Coast, and no one that is not affiliated with the West Coast. In terms of groups that best describe you, and hopefully you saw you can select more than one, we have about 16% identifying with recreational fishing industry and 23% identifying with commercial fishing industry. We also have about 30% of government or agency folk, another kind of 30% combined of environmental groups and researchers. We also have some folks that have identified as interested members of the public or other. So fantastic. Okay, with no further ado, thank you again. Happy that you're all here. Would love to turn it over to Craig for opening remarks. And Craig, welcome you to turn on your video as well. And Jess, please stop the screen share.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for joining. We've got a really great turnout and really pleased to see such a diverse group of folks. And I think that's very representative of this fishery. Again, as Sarah mentioned, we are going through challenging times, so thank you for taking the time to join this webinar. One of the things that I do, I'm an optimist by nature, to try to see myself through the days with all things COVID, social unrest, political division, of course, fire season in California history, is to look for the silver linings. For me, some of these silver linings have been being able to spend more time with my family and also to force myself to make the space to appreciate some of the smaller things in life that I may have previously taken for granted. One of the other silver linings is that we paused our scoping efforts that we had planned for this fishery last spring, and we will be re-engaging our scoping efforts with the benefit of the stock assessment and the peer review. And we've often talked internally with our team that this has actually been a benefit, that we'll have this new information as we start to engage the scoping process. Peer review is a critical part of our management process, and I want to expend a huge thank you to E.J. Dick, the chair of the peer review panel, and all of the panel members. I want to recognize Kat Meyer for her work. She conducted the stock assessment and then was burning the candle at both ends to see it through to the end. And also just want to recognize the OST and the strategic for their support. This is an extremely complex fishery. It operates along the entire coast and across multiple sectors, as we just saw from the poll review. Given these complexities, we view this as the jumping off point to engage tribes and stakeholders to determine the needs for the fishery, where additional management measures may be warranted, and desired outcomes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the experts and let us dive into the details. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Craig. Thanks for your remarks and for being here. I would love to now turn it over to Kirsten. Kirsten will be introducing, or for some folks, reintroducing us to the Fisheries Management Framework, the 2018 Master Plan, that's guiding CDFW's research to better understand and responsibly manage the California halibut resource. So Kirsten, welcome you to turn on your video, and please take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. So yes, again, my name is Kirsten Ramey. I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the State Managed Finfish Program with the Department's Marine Region. And it is my intention to open a dialogue today to facilitate understanding of the Department's prioritization of California halibut as part of the 2018 MLMA Master Plan for Fisheries, and also share details about the halibut stock assessment, a key management step that has been undertaken by the Department. Reflecting on the lessons that we learned during the update to the MLMA Master Plan, it's our hope that today's webinar will be a starting place where we can all work together to ensure this process is inclusive of tribal and stakeholder interests and priorities related to California halibut management. Next slide, please. So just to cover a little bit of background, enacted in 1999, the Marine Life Management Act is California's primary fishery management law. It identified sustainability as the primary objective and emphasized the need for a comprehensive ecosystem-based approach to managing the state's fisheries. It also emphasized the importance of informed public involvement in decision-making and science. The Act directs the Department to develop a master plan to guide the law's implementation. And in June of 2018, the Fish and Game Commission adopted the Master Plan for Fisheries. The Master Plan describes specific tools and approaches to be applied to achieve the goals of the MLMA. And those goals include enhancing the sustainability of the state's ocean fisheries, elevating ecosystem health and decision-making, helping promote efficient, effective, and streamlined fisheries management, establishing a clear pathway for improving the management of individual fisheries, setting clear expectations for managers and the public, and also to foster transparency and flexibility in fisheries management with tribes, stakeholders, and interested members of the public. Next slide. Yep, there we go. So this is the management framework as outlined in the Master Plan for Fisheries. So this provides the clear and consistent process that describes how management efforts should proceed and where specific MLMA policies are addressed during implementation. The top component of the framework describes the approach to prioritization, and the bottom half that's identified in the shaded boxes represents the approach to scaling the intensity of management for each fishery. We used a comprehensive approach to prioritizing our fisheries, which included a process to evaluate the relative risk that fishing may pose to each fishery, as well as impacts to habitat and bycatch species. And we are all here today because as a result of that prioritization process, California halibut was identified as a high priority species for management attention. Fisheries can vary significantly in terms of the appropriate intensity of management effort. So the management plan describes a continuum of management intensity and identifies criteria for determining where a given fishery may fall along the continuum. So levels of management responses can range from enhanced status reports for relatively low priority species to complex FMPs, or fishery management plans for fisheries that are relatively high priority and more complex. And later on in the webinar, I will touch base back on this framework and orient us to where we are with halibut and where we are moving forward in the process. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kirsten. Next slide, please. Okay, so we are moving into our next agenda item. Kirsten, feel free to turn off your video. Fantastic. So now for the overview of the 2020 stock assessment and peer review agenda item, we will have a series of presentations followed by our first Q&A session. So during this agenda item, we will be learning about the data collection and data analysis, as well as the stock assessment models that were used to evaluate the status of the halibut resource across the state. Our presenters will be sharing the key findings of the stock assessment, including potential implications for fisheries management, as well as be providing an overview of the peer review process and the findings from the technical panel that evaluated the assessment. They will discuss the evolution of the stock assessment based on the peer review panel recommendations as well, so we can follow along to understand how the stock assessment was updated based on the expertise of our technical experts. Next slide, please. Okay, so I would now like to welcome our three presenters. One you have already had the pleasure of hearing from. So first we will have Catherine Meyer, formerly the environmental scientist for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and currently the fish and wildlife biologist at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. A lot of fish and wildlife. I mentioned Kat's former role as her involvement in the stock assessment took place while she was still affiliated with CDFW. We will then hear from Anthony Rogers, the strategy director from the California Ocean Science Trust. And lastly, we will hear from E.J. Dick, program lead for the Fisheries Ecology Division at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. So welcome to the three of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here and sharing your results and insights. A reminder for our participants that we will keep the lines on mute. We will invite questions and comments through the Q&A and through the email throughout the presentations. We will flow from one presentation to the next. And so I think we have about 30 minutes or so of, maybe 40 minutes or so of presentation time. Kat will get us started with sharing about the stock assessment. Anthony will help us to understand the peer review process and OST's important role in leading that effort. And then EJ will help us to understand the results and the findings from the peer review process, in particular, the discussions with the panel. We are hopeful to have a Q&A following the presentations. That's about 15 or 20 minutes. We'll see how on time we can be, dedicated to our discussion with our participants. So at this point in time, would love Kat to turn on her video and take it away, and I will flag you at the 1 minute mark to help you wrap up if it's needed. Otherwise, I'll try to remain quiet. So welcome, Kat, and thank you.
Sarah. So as Sarah just mentioned, my name is Catherine Meyer. Until earlier this year, I was with the State Managed Fisheries Program at CDFW, where I did this California halibut work. So I'm momentarily stepping back into that role to sort of see it through to the end. So you can go to the next slide, please. There we go. So my intention today is to provide a really high-level overview of the assessment process to hopefully give enough background on the biology, the fishery, the data, the model structure, so that everyone has some level of understanding of how and why the model was structured the way that it was. And I'm going to, also provide some of the sort of just big picture results. This is a lot of information to squeeze into a really pretty short time frame. So I would encourage anyone that's interested in looking in much more detail to seek out the assessment document itself, which will be posted on CDFW's website at some point forthcoming here. Next slide, please. So I imagine that everyone that's here is here because you have some level of understanding of California halibut, but I wanted to make sure we're on the same sort of starting page. So I'm providing a little bit of biological background. Halibut are a West Coast flatfish species that's pretty widely distributed. They can be found as far south as the very southern tip of Baja, Mexico, and as far north as Washington on occasion. Most commonly, their sort of core distribution is thought to be south of Point Arena in California and down as far south as central Baja California Peninsula. They're a relatively shallow water flatfish species. The adults are found in the less than 300 feet range. Adults can be sort of highly mobile. They're thought to follow schools of forage fish and squid. They do live for a relatively long period of time. The oldest female that we've ever seen has been 30 years old. The oldest male is 23. It's very likely that they actually do live older than that, but that's the maximum that we've ever actually found in our own data. Females become reproductively mature between 4 and 5 years on average, and they're really very productive as a species. They broadcast thousands of eggs into the environment. They have a pelagic larval and egg stage for several months before they sort of make their way back to the more protected nearshore environments where they settle out as juveniles and spend, roughly a year there before moving back into deeper water. Females do grow larger and live to a longer age than males do, which is typical of other fish species as well. And it's important also to note that these patterns in growth, since they have such a wide distribution along the coast, patterns in growth, maturity, and spawn timing do change with latitude, which is probably a function of environmental conditions such as ocean temperature and things like that. We can move to the next slide. So there's been a very long history of commercial exploitation for halibut in California. It dates back to the late 1800s and possibly even earlier. Most of the landings we think came in Southern California. The gear types they used were pretty diverse during that time, as far back as that. Not as technologically advanced, obviously, as they are today, but using a lot of the same gear types, multiple types of trawls, entangling nets like gill nets and trammel nets. Nearshore beach seines were used in Southern California for a while in the earlier days before they were prohibited. Other than that, hook and line fisheries, just as they are today. The same with the recreational fleet. The early recreational fleet included the same gear types that we use today, mostly hook and line on commercial passenger fishing vessels or CPFVs, hook and line from shores, piers, personal vessels. There's not great catch information on the early recreational landings, however. And there also is some evidence of tribal take that dates back quite a ways longer than all of this. As old as 1,000 years ago, they found halibut otoliths in middens in Southern California. And I just want to note that tribal take is not explicitly considered in this assessment. Next slide, please. So this figure shows the history of commercial landings as far back as our data goes, which is to 1916. It's showing landings in pounds, and it includes all gear types combined together. And so you can see the green line starts in 1916. That represents the statewide landings. In 1930, you can see the blue and red line appear. That's Northern and Southern California. That's when the state of California started to actually record information on regional catch. So we can tease it out a little bit better. What's obvious is that the peak occurred quite a long time ago in landings, and there's some anecdotal evidence that predates our data that suggests that it was actually catch was even higher in the late 1800s. So the fishing down period occurred quite some time ago for this fishery. Another thing I'd like to kind of draw everyone's attention to is that the Northern and Southern California catch become approximately equal around 1970. And if you sort of fast forward to 2020, where we are today, Northern California has actually been exceeding Southern California in terms of landings. Next slide, please. So this is a very general snapshot of the different management approaches that we are taking currently as a department for all of the different gear types. So just to kind of illustrate the multi-pronged approach that we're using now, there are area closures that limit take for gill and trammel net, as well as trawl Trawling is prohibited in state waters except within the trawl grounds in Southern California, for example. There are also gear restrictions for gill and trammel nets. There's minimum mesh size. For trawling, for example, there's a light touch gear requirement in the trawl grounds. There are, for the hook and line fisheries, combined CPFB, commercial and recreational, there's various combinations of lines and numbers of hooks and things like that that are, depending on where you are, that are required. As far as effort restrictions go, the gill and trammel net is limited entry. And trawling is mostly limited entry. It's a little more complex in that there's a state limited entry program as well as a federal limited entry program. So those things kind of, cap the number of participants currently that can actually engage in the fishery. The recreational fleets have a bag limit, and as far as size restrictions go, that at least is pretty straightforward in that there's a 22-inch minimum legal size across the board for all gear types. And that's been the case for quite a few decades, since the beginning of the 70s. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into a great detail into like all of the individual data types and sets that we use, because there was a lot to discuss here. But I just wanted to call out that I looked at all of the available data that I could find for halibut and evaluated it, and that was really the brunt of the workload for this process. So things that I was looking for example, were things like the study design, looking at how data were collected and evaluating whether or not it should be included in the assessment. Is it randomly collected, over what time frame, and that kind of, those are the types of questions that were asked. Also looked at the geographic scope, for example, to see if a data collection program is regionally representative of the fishery, or if it's just over a really narrow geographic area. And I also wanted to acknowledge, in doing this, that a lot of different people and programs worked very hard to collect all of these types of data. So I just wanted to, issue a thank you and acknowledgement of all the hard work that went into that. From there, I think the data types can be categorized very broadly into two types. There are, fishery dependent collection, and there's fishery independent collection, essentially. So fishery dependent being things that are collected directly from the fleet, and they're representative of that fleet. Fishery independent data includes things like surveys that may use different gear, may have a broader scope or something like that. And their survey design isn't necessarily dictated by the gear type used in the industry. Next slide, please. So some example of the things that we take from fishery dependent data are documentation of the catch history. That's really important. We're able to get that information from California fish ticket data, as well as fishery observer data, recreational fish sampling, a variety of sources to kind of piece together what the catch history looked like for each different type of gear used. We also collect things like catch size and age composition information, and that comes from a lot of those same port sampling type efforts or recreational fish sampling efforts. Those are really important data streams that give us like a little window into what portion of the population that gear type is sampling. So that's also a really important component of what went into the model. I also used two effort indices, catch per unit effort indices that came from logbook data. So the trawl logs and the CPFE logs are actually really important pieces of information that went into this model to give us sort of a relative, a sense of the trend and relative abundance for each of those gear types. Next slide, please. A couple of examples of fishery independent data that went into the model. The San Francisco Bay study, it's cut off a little bit on the bottom, I apologize about that. But the San Francisco Bay study on the left-hand side is a really long-term data set that the department is involved in collecting. I think it started in 1980, and it samples really young fish using a small benthic otter trawl within the bay. And that was able to provide us with an index of young fish, of smaller fish within the Central California region. And to the right, the California Cooperative Oceanic Fisheries Investigation, or CalCOFI, gave us a really great source of information looking at larval abundance over time. Again, that's a really long-term data set that's conducted using plankton sampling gear in Southern California. Next slide, please. So my intention is that people don't strain their eyes too hard trying to look at these two figures. The take home from this is essentially this provides just sort of a snapshot over time of data availability. So for example, catch data is consistently available over the whole modeling time period for each fleet. But if you scroll down, it's categorized by different data types, and there are a lot of gaps and patches. So I just want to acknowledge that there aren't consistent data streams over the entire modeling period for this, and we're able to just incorporate what we have. Next slide, please. So moving on to how the model is structured, all of the information I just talked about was used and more used to inform the model structure itself. For example, our biological understanding is incorporated directly into how the model is structured. I mentioned earlier that males and females grow differently, so therefore we needed to use a two-sex model so that males and females are able to be modeled separately. We also know that it's a highly productive species, and that's something that's accounted for in the model structure itself. We use the appropriate number of age bins because we know how old they are typically getting in the environment. Things like that inform our biological understanding directly informs the model structure. Likewise, our knowledge of the fisheries informs how the model is structured. It incorporated 5 different fishing fleets, a trawl, a gillnet, a commercial hook and line, a CPFV, and then a just catch-all recreational fleet. And we know that doesn't perfectly encapsulate the variety of gear that are actually used in the environment, but given the data streams that we have available, those are the narrowest categories that we could get to, really, whilst still having enough representative data for each of those. Gear dynamics and our knowledge of the size limit influence how we understand the gear to be selecting. So we build in selection curves for each of those fleets. And the last bullet I have under this category is actually very important. I know EJ, I think, is going to discuss this a little further, but we know that the modeling period is far predated by the beginning of the fishery. So we don't have data, we don't have adequate data going back far enough in time to capture the beginning of the fishery. So we're starting it in a state that's already depleted. And so this was a challenge for both of these models, and something that we have to just acknowledge moving forward. So that was something that had to be considered when structuring the model itself. And as far as the type goes, it's an age-structured statistical catch-at-age model, and it's implemented in stock synthesis, which is a NOAA-developed program. It's used in most of the assessments at the council level. So move on to the next slide.
And Kat, just a friendly reminder, waving the 1-minute flag, please.
Oh gosh, okay, thank you.
Or 3 minutes, yes.
Okay,
just
thanks.
thoughtfully flagging it, thank you.
Okay, so the model also incorporates, when I say model, it's really 2 models that use exactly the same framework with different data. So there are really 2 stocks that are modeled independently, a southern and a central stock. There are a lot of reasons for that are outlined really in great detail in the assessment document itself. But in a nutshell, there's different biological processes happening across space, and there's some precedent for modeling them this way. So I'll leave it at that. We can move on to the next slide. So getting into the results section, so I know EJ is going to discuss the Northern model in probably greater detail than I am. I chose not to present any of the information. So essentially, what the Northern model did is we synthesized all of the available, I synthesized all of the available data and research and presented the results to the peer review. And during the peer review process, it was tested and evaluated for a lot of different things. And it proved to be not stable enough to be reliable for management at this point. So I think there are limitations that are going to be discussed in greater detail. However, I just want to acknowledge that it does provide a really solid synthesis of the available information that we have. So moving forward, you know, we're still at a better starting place. Next slide, please. As far as the southern region goes, the results, this is a time series of, this is really the meat of the results. This is the time series of relative biomass, or the fraction of unfished biomass that the model output. So to try and walk everybody through this, because there's a lot to unpack if you haven't been looking at figures like this previously. So on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you'll notice that there's the scale between 0 and 1. And the value of 1 represents an unfished population, and the value of 0 represents no fish in the environment, and everything in between, it would be the fraction left in the population. And so just think of these two lines as two base models. I won't get into the details there, but so you can see that you know, it's on the lower end of let's see, it's around less than 25% most of the time compared to unfished conditions. And as far as in thinking about what that means is a really big challenge, because those parameters haven't been defined in California, but it is still helpful, or specifically for California halibut. I'm sure this is, you know, going to be a long road moving forward through the fishery management process and trying to get at those values and what's appropriate. But here I just borrowed proxy values from the Pacific Fishery Management Council for flatfish species to give everyone sort of some context for looking at where we are. So you can see that it's sort of fluctuating between their management target and their management threshold throughout most of the time series. And so what this does is it gives you just a relative sense of where the population likely is. And in this relative time series proved to be, for the most part, stable to all of the alternative assumptions that were tested during the peer review process. You can go to the next slide. And so this is the absolute biomass, and I'm just showing because it shows the same exact trend as you saw previously. But one thing to note is that what wasn't robust to alternative assumptions during the peer review process was the actual scale of spawning biomass. And so that does prove, that does give us some limitations as far as if we wanted to implement like an actual management value, like a TAC, or total allowable catch. For example, that value output is not reliable from this model. So from that standpoint, that's not how we manage California halibut in California, but that's not an option as an output from the Southern model. So we can go to the next slide. So just to recap, the Southern model is in the relatively depleted zone throughout the modeling timeframe. That output seems relatively stable, and I think is adequate for giving a really good ballpark of where the Southern California stock is in relative terms. No management limits or targets have been defined, so you know, calling it deeming it healthy or not healthy hasn't really yet to be fleshed out by a management plan yet. I do think it's a really great starting point for the future management strategy evaluation work that's going to sort of kick off here moving forward for halibut. There is some uncertainty, as I mentioned, surrounding the scale of absolute biomass, which does limit the ability of it to provide specific management advice. like a TAC, which is not required under our current management framework. Next. And so as far as the northern model goes, just to recap really quickly, additional information is needed. We need more, a variety of things would be helpful in terms of data collection and information gathering for the future that I think would be helpful in sort of pinning down some of the problems or resolving some of the problems in the model. So I think EJ is going to provide a bit more information, but I would also really encourage everyone interested to look at the assessment document and the peer review document for a lot more detail. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kat. I'm sure we've already had some questions come in, so we will address questions to Kat following our next two presenters. So at this point in time, I would like to welcome Anthony to give us an overview of the peer review panel process. Anthony, please turn on your video when you get a moment and take it away. Thank you.
Here I am.
Love it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anthony Rogers. I'm the Strategy Director for California Ocean Science Trust. Ocean Science Trust is an independent nonprofit that convenes science expertise to accelerate progress towards healthy oceans in California. In the context of our peer review work, we serve as a neutral, independent convener that strives to bring, sorry, can you go to the next slide? I forgot I had to say that. There we go. In the context of our peer review work, we serve as a neutral, independent convener that strives to bring objectivity, transparency, candor, efficiency, and scientific rigor to every review we manage. To conduct this review process, we first worked with the department to establish a terms of reference to guide the scope and process of this review. This can be found on our website in case anyone is interested to see it. From there, we set out and surveyed a broad range of scientific and stock assessment experts for input on who would have the expertise to conduct this technical review. Then we further vetted those recommendations through the executive committee of the Ocean Protection Council's Science Advisory Team. Next slide, please. So after all of that work to vet the experts, I'm very pleased to present our peer review panel, starting with Dr. EJ Dick from NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center, who served as chair of this panel, and you'll hear from him in just a moment. Dr. Kiva Oken from the University of California, Davis, Dr. David Sampson from Oregon State University, and Dr. Chantel Wetzel from NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center. Next slide. As I mentioned, our responsibility in this process was to make sure the underlying assessment uses the best available science to inform the management approaches. The review began in May. I'll let EJ talk in a moment about the specifics of the workflow of the panel. But before I do, just wanted to flag two things that are on this. First is that we look to the Pacific Fishery Management Council's STAR review process as a guide to the approach the panel took here. And second, as I note on the slide, though the review is now complete, it doesn't really make sense to look at it without the context of the full panel report. So the review report will be made available to the public the moment the full stock assessment is out into the world, which again, as Kirsten mentioned, will be in the next couple weeks. All right, and with that introduction, I'm pleased to hand the mic over to EJ to talk in depth about the review and the panel's findings.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anthony. Welcome you to turn on your video, EJ, when you have a moment.
All right, can you hear me okay?
We can, and we can see you. Thank you.
Great. Well, first, I just want to quickly thank the department, OST, and Strategic Earth for making this possible and giving me a chance to go over the findings of the review panel. Again, my name is EJ Dick. I work with the National Marine Fisheries Service, Southwest Fisheries Science Center. I'm a stock assessment scientist and team lead. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to be covering the review panel's report, which was about 40 pages. So this is just going to be highlights of the report and a general overview. The general workflow of the review panel was over 4 days. During my talk here, I might make a reference to the STAT because it's habit, but we refer to the stock assessment team, which in this case is Catherine. And I might also just refer to the panel, and in that case, I'm referring to the review panel. We received materials 2 weeks in advance of day one. And on that day, we received presentations from Catherine on halibut biology, fishery data, and models. That was followed by a series of requests that the panel put together. And in each subsequent day of the review, Kat would bring her results of those requests, and we would have discussion, and just the grilling session would start again. So this was a lot of work, and I really appreciate how responsive Catherine was during the review, and I think we've made a lot of progress. So for full details of the report, you can see when it's posted online. And next slide. So we had 30 requests in all, and in the report, you'll see the request itself, a rationale, the basis for the request, and then a response summary. So you can, the language in the report can be technical at times. It's just the nature of these modeling efforts. But the major topics just can be boiled down to how discard data were included in the models and treated, how growth of halibut, as Kat mentioned, there's separate growth for males and females in the models, how that was handled in each model. And then also, perhaps the biggest issue was this estimation of the initial conditions, or how depleted the stock was at the beginning of the modeled time period. This is a somewhat uncommon approach for West Coast flatfish species, and it's a data-hungry approach. And so, as Kat mentioned, there was varying success depending on the region it was applied to. So, but in general, we found that the new discard treatment that was adopted during the panel better reflected the amount of available data. The goal with growth estimation was to estimate growth within the model, ideally, because that allows you to propagate your uncertainty in halibut growth through to the model results. And then we agreed among the panel members that having a model in which the initial conditions, the parameters governing that starting point were fixed, wouldn't be acceptable for management, because that basically predetermines how large the stock would be at the beginning of the model time period, which is something that's clearly hard to say we know much about. So next slide. So I'll briefly go over each model and some of the topics we covered. As Kat mentioned, for the northern area, the model time period was 1980 to 2019, and covered the area you see in the figure in the top right corner, roughly Point Arena to Point Conception. During the review, as I mentioned before, there was some improvements to how the discard data were treated. Additional age data were included into the model, which we think improved and actually allowed for the estimation of growth, at least 2 of the 5 parameters in the model that describe growth. And then also there were some refinements to the size selectivity of the gear used by the San Francisco Bay Trawl Survey. Things that were not resolved to the I think the panels or the stats satisfaction were that the initial condition parameters could not be estimated. So essentially the model was unstable. On the next slide, I'll show some examples of this. Male growth remained fixed as it was represented as relative to female growth, and those parameters were estimated outside of the model. And the model still remains sensitive to a few assumptions about how annual variation in recruitment was treated and the weighting of data sets. So next slide, please. So the one of the big sticking points was uncertainty in stock status, or this relative spawning output. So these plots are similar to what Kat showed in her presentation, but just to keep it brief, the figure on the left shows two alternative models with different assumptions, and you can see that the starting biomass varied considerably. In this case, it had to do with at what point in time annual recruitment deviations were estimated in the model, and that's essentially how many young fish are coming into the population in a given year. And then on the right, there was another assumption we were looking at, and that had to do with how different data sets were emphasized in the modeling. And as you can see, the terminal depletion, the blue line showed a very much higher ending stock status than the red line. And so what that suggests is that there's some conflict between the different data sources, depending on how much you weigh each one changes the outcome dramatically. So next slide. For the southern model, it was a slightly longer time period, went back to 1971 and covered the area from Point Conception to the US-Mexico border. During that one, we also improved the discard treatment and included the additional age data in the model. And this model was it was possible to estimate the initial conditions. So that was a big accomplishment that happened during the review panel, I thought. And however, there were a few points that the panel pointed out in the report that had to do with the methodology used to weigh the different data sets. There were some inconsistencies there with current practice and other assessments. And the treatment of the California Cooperative Fishery Investigation Index, which Kat showed, that covers Southern California. It is a survey of ichthyoplankton, or larval fish in the water column, and is a measure of the size of the parental stock over time. There's also, there were some issues with the calculation of the equilibrium catches in terms of definitions that were unclear. And so we asked that that be better documented in the final assessment. And I know that Kat is working on that. Next slide, please. So here's an example similar to what Kat showed. And this was a earlier version of the model, but as you can see, under different assumptions, the relative biomass trends in the southern model were more stable. As Kat noted, the absolute biomass, the actual size of the population isn't shown here. This is just relative to an unfished state. So this stability in the relative biomass trend doesn't really imply that the population sizes estimated by each one of these different models would be the same. So there is some uncertainty there, and that would lead to difficulties in management depending on how the department chooses to move forward with their reference points and management approach. So I think that's all I have here. Oh, there was one example of that, was that assumptions to the reproductive biology of the stock did cause the population scale to shift. And so that was one example of a sensitivity we did during the panel. So next slide. So to wrap up, the panel found that the northern area model wasn't quite ready to be used for management. And the rationale, I won't go through all of these here, but was laid out in the report. And largely, I'd say the biggest one was the fact that the initial conditions could not be estimated, but there were a few others. Next slide. The southern model was able to estimate the initial conditions, so that was a big hurdle that was overcome. But then there were a few technical issues that we asked the department to look into before using it for management, and that had to do with the revision of the data weighting method, the CalCoffee index, and also some of the documentation related to equilibrium catches to make sure that they were consistent with the model being used. And I think I'm getting close to the end here. Can we go one more slide? I think there's some recommendations here. Yes, right. So One of the sections of the document is recommendations for future research. We divided those up into two categories: those that can rely on existing data sets and those that would require additional data collection. So I've listed here a few of those that would not require additional data collection. One of the big ones is this reconstruction of historical catch time series. So the models, as I mentioned before, started in 1971 and 1980. Particularly for the northern model, since the fishery developed later in time, the panel felt that it would perhaps be the most beneficial model to apply this technique to, because it's likely that the stock was in a much less depleted state, and the model could be brought back to a starting point of maybe the 1930s or something like that, and that would provide some stability to the estimation procedure. So that was one of our strong recommendations. The southern model, of course, has a much longer history of exploitation, but luckily that one was also more stable in estimating the initial conditions, so that might not be as pressing. And I won't go through each one of these individually due to time constraints, but this is a summary, and you can see the full review panel report for the complete list. Next slide. So in terms of analyses that require additional data collection, and this is something that we do with stock assessments in the council process very often, is we give recommendations. Sometimes they can be maybe a little pie in the sky because there are obviously budget-related constraints, and this is basically just from the science standpoint, what would be most likely to benefit the model as it existed during the review process. And those included increased sampling of age structures, to try to improve the growth estimation within the model, additional information on discards, which can be difficult to collect in some fisheries. But also, as I mentioned before, the model was sensitive to some of the assumptions about halibut reproductive biology, so additional studies into fecundity and maturity could help. And then data collection outside of the areas that were currently assessed, so north of Point Arena and then south of the US-Mexico border. And I think that is my last slide, but tab ahead just to see. Oh yes, one more. In terms of the review process itself, we had some recommendations, and that was that there was a terms of reference provided for the review process. But one thing that would be beneficial to a future review panel would be to have a terms of reference for the stock assessment document itself, with a list of elements that are required, and then also a description of what are the specific management goals or targets for California halibut. And as I understand it, that is one of the next steps in this process. So that's up to the department to decide. But once those are established, it will be easier for the panel to decide whether or not an assessment model is adequate to inform that particular question. And lastly, we felt that inviting advisors to the review panel, for example, industry representatives, could be helpful to give some perspective on the history of the fishery and whatnot when questions come up. And Kat was a team of one in this process, and she did an amazing job, but perhaps having additional representatives to help with the requests would help things move along. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, EJ. Well, thank you to all three of you for all of that information. I think it's going to set us up quite nicely for folks to continue their learning by reading the documents when they're available, and of course, ask their questions as we have time now. So as we move into the Q&A, we have about 20 minutes to answer questions, hear your comments. Hopeful that there's a sufficient amount of time to hear from many of you and that our time together can be productive. Just a reminder, we'll read out a mixture of questions and comments that come in from the Q&A chat. We've been inviting you to submit questions there, and we will also open the lines and hear from folks directly. We'll just try to balance the two and see how it goes, and we can update as needed for the next Q&A session. We do want to ask that you hold questions related to the broader picture of what will happen next for the halibut fishery until the next agenda item after Kirsten provides some more information on the development of the roadmap and the timeline for scaled management. At this time, we would like to focus the Q&A on questions related to the master plan context, the stock assessment, and the peer review. So thank you for your understanding. I would also like to just briefly go over some guidance so that folks know how to engage in this Q&A. So if you are on Zoom, on the screen share, at the bottom, you will see participants, two little people and a number. If you click that, I believe that you will then see a chat open. And at the bottom right, there's a little hand and it says raise hand. So if you would like to ask a question or make a comment verbally, you will need to click that raise hand button. If you're not on Zoom on the internet, but rather you're calling in, then you will need to press *9 or *9, and that will be how you can unmute yourself or how you can raise your hand. So what we will do on our end is track the queue of either names, if you've submitted your name, or if it's just your phone number that shows up, that's fine. And then we will verbally say, okay, Joe, coming to you. On our end, we will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. Of course, if you're calling in on your phone and you've muted yourself, you will also need to unmute. I know I'm saying the word mute and unmute a lot. So there's some guidance here. After you state your question, we will ask that you mute yourself again, *6, or if you're calling in on your phone by pressing the mute button. So we'll leave that up for a few minutes as we begin the Q&A just to give folks to digest it. I know that, yes, technology makes things exciting. Okay, so in the meantime, I would love to invite all of our speakers to turn on their videos so that we can see everyone and try to make this, as, yes, dialogue-y by seeing faces as we can. And we do have a question that's come in from the Q&A, so I will read that out loud. Jeff Schester, and it looks like there was an anonymous attendee who also asked a similar question, would like to ask this question to Kat. What is the evidence for 2 stocks, and does the southern stock extend into Mexico? How is the population in Mexico considered in this assessment? So Kat, welcome you to respond.
Great. That's an excellent question. And that's something that's addressed in more detail in the assessment document. I had to sort of gloss over it, unfortunately, for the sake of time during the presentation. But it is an assumption that the stock ends at the U.S.-Mexico border that we know is violated to some extent. The consequences of that are a little bit unclear. The reason I don't say it wasn't. It's not that it wasn't considered, it's just that obtaining data from Mexico is a challenge, and it's unclear if it's actually recorded in a way that would be informative. Conapesca, I think, manages the halibut fishery in Mexico. And as far as I was able to tell, it's only recorded commercially to the species code of flatfish in aggregate. So that's not something that could be really looked at. So there's an assumption made there, absolutely. I think there's a second part to that question, which is what was the rationale between stock boundaries in general? To the north of that, there's two things, I guess. One is just it was a way to capture biological differences that occur across latitude. As we have some information on growth and maturity, and we know they're different between Southern and Central California. We don't have any of that information further to the north, north of Point Arena. Let's see, so that was one of the primary reasons. I think some justification was used in the previous assessment. We used the same boundaries that the 2010 assessment did. And so the other thought was that it makes it a little more comparable to those results. And then additionally, that Point Conception maybe is a sort of oceanographic barrier to movement, and that's a little unclear. I'm not sure if that's really supported by the data. Let me know if that sufficiently answered your question.
Oh, I was on mute. Thank you, Kat. I think that's great. And if there's more follow-up, we invite that. We have a question coming in from the chat from just, I think it's an anonymous attendee because I don't have a name to read out right now. Does spawning occur in the bay as well as the ocean near shore areas? And this is asked to you as well, Kat.
Does spawning occur in the bay as well? There's, to my knowledge, no. I don't know if there's been much evidence for that. I actually would have to probably defer to a colleague of mine though to like confirm that for sure.
Thank you. Kirsten and others, if anybody has any more information about that particular question, welcome you to chime in. I should say that if I ask you a question, it doesn't mean that I'm trying to box anybody in. Others, please feel free to support whoever I've pinged on. I'm just doing my best to allocate. I'll just pause to see if Kirsten or others have any help with that question. Okay. Moving on, we have a question from Eddie addressed to Kat or Kirsten. Would it be advisable to separate the two areas of biomass into at least 3 with a boundary created at Point San Pedro or Santa Cruz in order to tease out more specific data?
I'm sorry for the delay. I'm thinking about that question. That's a great thought. I think something moving forward would actually, it would be really beneficial to look at finer scale spatial structure in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Kat.
I don't know if
EJ, would you like to add on?
Oh, just one comment in that in a situation where you have a good amount of data that's really distributed evenly over space, that can help. One of the issues that comes up is when you start dividing the stock into small pieces, that your sample sizes within each area drop. And so sometimes you can have unintended consequences of that and or higher uncertainty in your results for each area. So I think a first step would be to look at those two areas to see if there are actually differences in the exploitation history or the biological growth, maturity, fecundity, see if there are differences that were used to divide the stock into two areas first, and then see if you see those, then perhaps go that route. But if the two areas, perhaps in the north were similar, then maybe it's better to aggregate them.
Thank you both. Thanks, EJ, for those additional thoughts. I wanted to share a comment that came in from the chat from Star. Cheryl Barnes' MS thesis at Moss Landing Marine Labs showed that spawning occurs in the ocean in Central California. So thank you for helping us to address that question. Checking in on the queue for raised hands, it looks like we have Eddie who has raised his hand. So Eddie, we will come to you to see if you would like to speak out loud. So just please unmute Eddie and let us know when that's the case. And then Eddie, you'll be able to come through.
You should have the ability to talk.
Perfect. Eddie, let us know if you're having any troubles. A reminder that you may have yourself on mute, so to double check your phone, the mute button, or press
can you hear me?
*6.
Can you hear
Oh,
me?
yes, we can. Go
Hi,
ahead.
hello.
Thanks, Eddie.
Hello, everyone. Kat, you've done a hell of a job, I got to say, with trying to put all that data together by yourself. That's pretty impressive. I also had that question about defining the biomass in different areas, and I kind of looked at that as a manner to tease out more data that would be more pertinent to management structures. Again, it comes into the question of, in the management, are you looking to take and localize management, or are you looking to take and do a broader management over the entire state for the California halibut? So that's one of the questions I had also wanted to know, would data for the northern region, I know your data soft on the northern region there, would it be advantageous for you to take and contact local fishermen here who could probably give you a lot of data that you don't have access to otherwise? Myself included. I have landing records back from when I started fishing in 1972. So that would, and most of that was California halibut, but I've also been fishing for California halibut for, like I say, since 1972. It's my primary source of income at the time here. I know what's happened here over history. I have a pretty good idea of the history since that time to now, and that's concurrent yearly. So if you would need, again, contact with me, I think it could be very beneficial for your data collection.
Thank you. That's a wonderful offer. I think it's pretty valuable to have people's perspectives who've been engaged in the fishery for that long. So unfortunately, I'm no longer with the department, but I think if you want to get in touch with Kirsten, I think that could be really helpful.
Yep, I appreciate that. And also, as far as spawning goes, the halibut are spawning to this day, right now, even now. It's been a very long season. I see we get milting males within the bay and also outside the bay.
Mm-hmm. Are you in which bay? Are you Humboldt?
I'm in
or
San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay.
San Francisco, yeah. So
yeah.
we're seeing, and the thing this year, it was really quite unusual. I was getting milting males at 21 pounds, 21-pound milting males, which are very large. We're seeing a mix in a biomass. We're seeing fish from 8 to 10 inches up to 40 pounds. So there's a pretty broad structure here. Mostly 12 to 15 pound fish are the year class that is really prominent.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing all of that. That's great information to have. Absolutely. Are you a hook and line fisherman or?
Yes, I am. I'm a hook and line fisherman.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Love it. Well, just in the interest of time, thank you, Eddie, for sharing your comments. And as a next step, we will make sure that we can put you in touch with CDFW to continue that conversation. And thanks, Kat, for your remarks. So we have another question coming in, a question from the chat from Tom Marking, who's identified with Northern California, addressed to EJ or Kat. How do you account for discard mortality in both the commercial and recreational sectors?
EJ, do you want to answer that, or should I?
You go ahead.
Okay. So that's an excellent question, and I didn't talk at all about that in the presentation, but there is a lot of documentation on the methods or the rationale used to come up with a discard mortality rate for each of the fisheries in the assessment document. They're different for each gear type, and they're based on different sources of information. The hook and line gear types, I think, apologies, I'm having to sort of think off the top of my head. I haven't been thinking about halibut for the last couple of weeks. So I think it's 10% for hook and line gear, and that's based off of some CDFW work that was done in the Bay Area on hooking injuries for halibut specifically, using hook and line gear. And let's see, so there's more information about that specifically in the document. For the gill net gear, there was an observer program for quite a few years in Southern California that recorded the disposition of discarded fish. So if they were dead, for example, when they were discarded, that was recorded versus a live fish. So those data were used to inform the discard mortality rate for gill net gear. Trawl gear, we looked at, there was less information for looking at trawl discard mortality. So we looked at some of the logbook data and tried to get a sense of a rough proportion of toe length, I guess I should rephrase that. How long people were towing for halibut versus, sort of short tow. So we came up with sort of a ratio looking at, you know, how many tows were long versus how many short, made some assumptions about fish surviving after a certain tow duration. Apologies, I don't think I explained that very well, but it is documented in the assessment, the document that'll be forthcoming. I don't know if you have anything to add, EJ.
No, that was great.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kat. Just a reminder, we're currently getting most questions in from the Q&A chat, which is fine. If you do wish to come through, please find the raise hand button and we will track a queue of names or phone numbers as those come in. So we've got another question from Jeff Shester to Kirsten or Anthony. The federal stock assessment peer review process provides transparency to the public by distributing draft assessments to the public before the review and allowing public participation in the STAR panel. Why is this process differing in terms of transparency and public access? And Kirsten or Anthony, I will ask you to just address what the STAR panel is, just as a reminder for folks that may not know. And I'm also not seeing Kirsten on video. So Kirsten, welcome you to turn on your video and a reminder to unmute yourself to come through.
So I don't know, Anthony, do you want to cover the STAR panel? I have to admit that, you know, I do not participate in the federal management process, so I am not intimately familiar with the STAR panel, but I can essentially say for state managed fisheries, we are mandated to manage our fisheries under the Marine Life Management Act, what I touched on earlier in today's webinar. So the process that we follow is to ensure that we are implementing the MLMA and not following a federal process as the Pacific Fisheries Management Council does. But Anthony, I don't know if you want to describe more specifically what the STAR panel is under PFMC.
I kind of don't, only because it's very long, there's a lot there. But the STAR panel is essentially the full process, and I think I don't know if it's the best use for our time. I could kick this question over to EJ, who's way more familiar with the STAR panel process than I am, but it is sort of the guidelines for federal stock assessment reviews. And I feel like this question might have partially been sort of my fault for unclear and on going through my slides so quickly, but we did look to the STAR panel as a basis for the review process. But as you noted, Kirsten, there are differences between how the state manages this review and how federally managed fisheries review. We also, you know, like from the perspective of the review itself, took the very narrow view of this is the technical review of particularly the modeling underlying the stock assessment, with the understanding that this is the beginning of the whole review process, and therefore there's going to be a whole bunch of public engagement and transparency from this point forward. So that's the answer I have, unless EJ, you want to say something about the STAR panel. But again, we could take up 2 hours talking about that process.
The STAR panel is largely just the peer review process. I mean, there are quite a bit to unwrap, but essentially they tend to happen over a 1 week period for one species. But it's the series of review panel meetings, peer review process.
Okay, thank you to the three of you. It looks like we have time for one more question or comment. So looks like we have a question/comment coming up. Question and comment from Eddie for Kat. For halibut mortality by hook and line, are you referring to Travis Tanaka's study done in the San Francisco Bay? Also note that hook and line methods are not all the same. There are several, such as live bait and wire line. Hooking mortality is different in each case. More data definition is needed to determine the actual mortality by gear type, perhaps. So Kat, welcome you to comment on whether or not that's the study you're referring to. If so, this is something that we can provide as a resource as part of our next steps to folks.
Yeah, great comment, Eddie. I am referring to Travis Tanaka's hook and line study in San Francisco Bay, and definitely acknowledge that it's a really rough approximation of discard mortality rate, and it's kind of just the best information that we have. And I agree, more information on that specifically and the diversity in gear used would be really helpful for the future.
Thank you, Kat. Okay, so thanks to folks for submitting those questions and comments. I'll do a last check to make sure there's no more hand raises. Okay, I don't see any. So in that case, would like to move us forward into the next agenda item. Perfect. Okay, so as part of our next agenda item, we'll be turning things back over to Kirsten to help us understand what it will look like to build a roadmap for the California halibut fishery in terms of mapping out scales management process. And then following Kirsten's presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A, about 10 or so minutes. So Kirsten, with no further ado, welcome you to share your presentation, please. Thank you. And a reminder for folks, we'll keep you on mute and continue to accept questions and comments coming in. Thank you.
So as I mentioned earlier, the department's been actively working to implement the Master Plan for Fisheries since its adoption by the Fish and Game Commission in June of 2018. And one of the key steps towards implementation involves completing the customized ecological risk assessment and prioritization process for California fisheries. And as a reminder, results of that prioritization process identified California halibut as a high priority species for management attention. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we would touch base back on this framework. So the department is, hold on one second, there we go. Sorry, just as a reminder, so fisheries vary significantly in terms of the appropriate intensity of management effort. So the master plan describes a continuum of management intensity and identifies criteria for determining where a given fishery may fall along the continuum. So we're looking at this scaled management continuum down in the gray box. Levels of management responses can range from an enhanced status report. There we go. There's the highlighted area. For relatively low priority species to a complex fishery management plan for fisheries that are relatively high priority and more complex. The MLMA emphasizes the need for transparency in management and the importance of communicating management decisions and the condition of fisheries to the public. The Marine Species Portal has been completed and is now active, and this is an online, publicly accessible and user-friendly living library that includes thus far the context of 30 enhanced status reports on California state managed fisheries. And just to say out loud, the halibut enhanced status report is currently in progress and is scheduled to be available on the California Fisheries Portal in early 2021. So we are now moving through this highlighted portion of the framework, and I'm going to touch on kind of these next steps and where we're going from here. So next slide, please. So as we move into this stage of framework for halibut, we are moving through what we're calling the scaled management development process. We are here in the very first informational gathering process phase with the assessment of the status of the California halibut resource. Over the coming months, we will transition into what we are calling the exploration phase, which will include several scoping and engagement steps. And learning from the knowledge gathered in these two phases, we will then make informed decisions about the appropriate strategies for management of California halibut and move into developing and implementing these management strategies at the appropriate scale. I will talk more about these two phases and immediate next steps in the following slides. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're in this informational gathering phase to gain a better understanding about stock depletion, bycatch, ocean conditions, and other issues of concern for the fishery. The information gathering phase is focused on building knowledge from key findings from the prioritization process, from the stock assessment, from a management strategy evaluation, from ecosystem and habitat considerations, and bycatch evaluation efforts. Results generated through these information gathering projects will be incorporated into the California Halibut Enhanced Status Report that I just mentioned. So as you can see, we have completed the ecological risk assessment and prioritization process. That's why halibut was identified as a high priority species. Today you received the high level overview of the stock assessment and peer review. And we are currently in progress of developing a management strategy evaluation, looking at habitat ecosystems and bycatch, considering habitat relationships, and all of this will get incorporated into the enhanced status report that will be available in early 2021. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, in the coming months, the department will initiate the exploration phase for California halibut, and this will be focused on building collaborative relationships with tribes, stakeholders, and the community to gain a better and thorough understanding of the current status of the resource and develop a shared vision for addressing priority management concerns. We're committed to engaging with tribes and interested stakeholders to begin scoping ideas, options, and concerns to inform and advance the sustainable management of this fishery. We will identify a clear process for informing and engaging with the Fish and Game Commission and committees. Results from the informational gathering phase will help promote the exchange of information about priorities and concerns for halibut management. The goal of this phase will be to build the community's understanding of the current status of the resource, receive feedback from the community on concerns, challenges, and priorities, and together develop a vision and roadmap for the scaled management approach. Next slide. So we aim to design and implement what we're calling a scoping process that facilitates relationship building and exchange of information. We strive to conduct a transparent, inclusive, and adaptive process to share information we've learned through information gathering, and importantly, learn from our community and stakeholders your perspectives and insights. We're hopeful that the scoping process will help build a knowledge base of the current status of the resource. And with this knowledge and your expertise and experiences, we can meaningfully discuss opportunities, challenges, priorities, and concerns. We want to better understand your preferred communication and engagement methods for our different stakeholders and put these into practice to ensure active involvement in decision-making, including the development of a roadmap and timeline for scaled management. So continuing to think how we can build off today's webinar and continue with strong engagement. There is potential for a webinar series in the next year, and there will be opportunity to have targeted discussions with different fleets and sectors. Last slide. So as I mentioned, we're here in the information gathering stage, and in the coming months, we're moving into the exploration stage. And then from these two stages, we will learn and take that information to inform our next steps in scaled management. And we look forward to hearing from you as we move through this process. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kirsten. A reminder for folks, welcome you to submit questions and comments through the Q&A and also raise your hand using the raise hand button. We have about 10 minutes to answer questions related to CDFW's next steps to design the process for scaled management. Okay, so it looks like we have a question that's come in from the chat from an anonymous attendee addressed to Kirsten. Thank you for the information you are sharing. When and how will social scientific information about the California halibut fishery be incorporated into the MSE and other parts of the management process? And Kirsten, please just touch base on what MSE is in case there's any confusion.
Sure. So MSE is Management Strategy Evaluation, and the department's currently working with contractors to develop the functionality to evaluate a multi-fleet, multi-stock halibut fishery and look at management strategies that we could potentially consider. So that the functionality is currently being developed, and we hope that once that tool is available for actual use, then we can, through our scoping process, incorporate feedback from interested stakeholders to gain concerns and test different management strategies that stakeholders are interested in and that make sense for the fishery.
Thank you, Kirsten. Not seeing any more questions come in at the moment. So we'll just pause for a minute or two. Okay, we've had a question come in. Sorry for the lag. We're just doing this in real time. Okay, it's from an anonymous attendee. How do the current marine protected areas play a part in the management strategy? Kirsten, welcome your insights.
Sure. So the current, MPAs identify areas where, fisheries are allowed to occur versus where fisheries are not allowed to occur. So that is something that we do incorporate into our data collection, and it gets captured in the stock assessment and will get captured in the management strategy evaluation as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Kirsten. We have a question from, I think it's Gilly Lyons. Just a quick clarifying question about the ESR process. Did I hear correctly? Oh, I'm just waiting for my team to put that question back in. Did I hear correctly that the results of the MSE would be incorporated into the ESR process? If so, is the MSE something that will be completed by early 2021?
So we anticipate the functionality of the MSE to be available for use within the next couple of months. The management strategy evaluation will become an appendix to the enhanced status report once it's completed. The enhanced status report is near completion, and so there may be a delay for when the actual MSE is appended to it. We don't want to delay the availability of the enhanced status report. So that will become available, and the management strategy evaluation will be in progress as we work through that scoping process with stakeholders to develop different actions that we want to test. And at some point in time, they will become linked to each other up on the species portal.
Thank you, Kirsten. We have a question from Jeff Schuster. Will the scaled management process consider halibut as a target species only, or will the fishery be recognized as a multi-species fishery?
I'm not sure that I quite understand Jeff's question. I don't know if he's comfortable or if we have an opportunity to unmute him.
Sure, so let me just rephrase it and see if I can make sense of it, and we'll come to Jeff if that doesn't make sense. I think the question is really, in a scaled management approach, will the fishery be recognized as a multi-species fishery? So considering not only the target species, but potentially bycatch species. And at this point in time, I would love to, yep. Okay, your thoughts, and then we'll check in with Jeff.
Yeah, so definitely MLMA, mandates us to take an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management. So as part of the bycatch evaluation, we are looking not just at the target species, but we are looking at the gear types that are utilized for both the target species and other species, and taking an approach to incorporate an ecosystem look at the halibut fishery as a whole. Hopefully that is what Jeff was looking for.
Okay, looks like Jeff has raised his hand, so let's open the lines for Jeff and see. Oh, okay, I hear you. Go ahead. I think I heard you coming through, Jeff. You'd like to ask your question or make a statement?
Okay, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Okay, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to clarify. Throughout the master plan process, there was quite a bit of discussion, particularly on the bycatch working group, about in any fishery management process, what species are considered as target species in a fishery versus which are the bycatch species. And there was general agreement, and I think a strong support, particularly from the fishing industry, to recognize some of these fisheries, like for the halibut trawls and the set gill nets, as explicitly multi-species targeting. Because there's a very big difference between how you manage a species as a target species under the MLMA versus considering it solely a bycatch species. And so that's something that was kind of not clarified before, and and it sounds like the department has already made a decision to only look at halibut as the only target species and consider everything else bycatch species. But I was just trying to confirm whether that decision's been made yet, or whether that will be determined in scoping.
I would suggest, Jeff, that is something that we can further discuss in scoping. I would suggest that, currently no decisions have been made. We, as I presented, we haven't determined what the actual scaled management approach should be for halibut in particular. And as part of scoping, if we determine that it's more of a mixed species approach that's needed, that's something that we could consider.
And this is Craig. I'll just chime in. I don't expect we would consider everything else bycatch. We would look at what those species are, what the retention rates are, what the discard rates are, and use that to inform the next steps.
Thank you, Kirsten and Craig. Thanks, Jeff, for coming through. Okay, we have a question from Eddie. How will you be contacting stakeholders for inclusion in this process? And just to say out loud, we will be talking a little bit about this as part of next steps, but welcome Kirsten and Craig to share some thoughts.
So the department developed an extensive contact list, and hopefully you were contacted either by the department directly, or perhaps if you have worked with Strategic Earth or OST in the past, you were contacted through their listservs, but that is the primary goal. And we also have department staff who are reaching out to industry participants, in particular requesting guidance on whether or not they do want to participate and the best way to contact them. But I also encourage anybody and everybody to reach out to me directly if you do want to stay informed, and I will make sure that you are on our contact list moving forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kirsten. And we will be sharing Kirsten's email on a slide as we close, and inviting that invitation to everybody, extending that invitation to everyone. Okay, a question from an anonymous attendee via the chat. Who is developing the MSE tool?
Yes, the MSE tool is being developed by Adrian Hordick and Tom Carruthers, who are with the University of British Columbia. They created the Data Limited Methods Toolkit, which the department has implemented for 8 of our species, and we are taking halibut a step further to refine that tool for fisheries that require more of a multi-fleet, multi-stock functionality. And I think Adrian is participating with us today, so it's great for him to stay informed with what's happening on this side of the assessment.
Thank you, Kirsten. Okay, just wanting to give us another 2 minutes or so if questions do come in. I've read all that have been submitted so far. Just done a quick check. There are no raised hands, so maybe I'll just give us another minute before we move on to the next steps. Okay, we have a question coming in from the chat. Have the objectives of the MSE process been defined? How were those obtained, and are they listed in any document for review? This question comes from Tom Marking, and he continues the comment, for reference, I have been on an IPHC MSE committee for Pacific Halibut for 8 years and are just now completing that document for review. So any insights on the MSE? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can provide some insight. So they have not been defined for California halibut. As I mentioned, we're currently just testing the functionality of the tool. We've defined some reasonable management strategies to try and test the tool to just make sure the functionality is working. But the process, the comprehensive management strategy evaluation process is one that we hope to work with stakeholders through.
Thank you, Kirsten. Okay, not seeing any more questions coming in. I will just do a double check on the raised hands. Okay, there are no raised hands. So thank you, Kirsten, and thank you to folks that submitted their questions and comments. I did want to acknowledge that there were questions in the previous agenda item that we didn't get to, but in order to try to target the different Q&As, we've decided to hold off on answering those. So those will show up in the transcript that is posted publicly. Just didn't want to bring those into this Q&A to allow time for folks to ask questions specific to the roadmap piece. So just wanted to acknowledge that if you did submit additional questions that were not read out loud. Okay, so moving on into our final agenda item, next steps and participant feedback. So I would just like to briefly present some next steps that you can look forward to and invite you all to share your experience about today's webinar experience. We'll send a link in just a moment. Next slide, please. So today's presentations from all of our speakers, the webinar recording itself, the transcript of the closed captions, and the Q&A comment transcript that will be anonymous will all be posted to the CDFW and OST website by the end of November. The transcript, again, will remain anonymous unless you specified that you would like your name included. In that case, it will show up. And I should just mention out loud that I believe the webinar recording itself at this moment in time will only be housed on the OST website, just due to accessibility and other constraints. The remainder of those materials that I've just mentioned should show up on both websites. Earlier in the webinar, I mentioned that as neutral facilitators, we'll be helping to support the development of a key theme summary. So the summary will be developed that highlights the key themes from the webinar in terms of questions that were asked and perspectives that were shared. This summary is anticipated to also be available by the end of November, so the same timeline as the package of materials that we've just discussed. Any questions, comments, perspectives, poll results, even the survey results, all of those will be anonymous, but they will help to inform the summary. So they may show up, but no personal information will be shared in the summary. So I've mentioned a few times, invite you to share your feedback with us by completing the webinar participant feedback survey. We will keep the survey open until Wednesday, November 11th. So I think that's about 2 weeks. The link is shown on the screen. We're also going to drop that link into the chat so that you can click on it and go right there as I wrap up the webinar. It should only take a few minutes, and your feedback really is greatly appreciated. It's helpful for us to know how folks are feeling about today's webinar, but also, as Kirsten mentioned, with the scoping process coming up and the potential for a webinar series, it'll be very helpful for CDFW to understand if this is working or not, and what updates they can make to better meet the needs of everybody. And I'm sure OST will find the information useful as well as they help to put on webinars and share information for other projects. You may be directly guided to the survey once you click leave on today's meeting, just to say that out loud, so that may pop up. Okay, we've dropped that into the chat, so you should have that information. Next slide, please. Okay, as CDFW heads towards the scoping phase for scales management, they will be working to develop a community and stakeholder contact list. And Kirsten already spoke about this in response to, I believe it was Eddie's question. If you would like to be added to this contact list, please email kristen.ramey@wildlife.ca.gov to join the contact list. The contact list will only be used at this time to share updates related to the California halibut scales management process, and also to send invitations for any upcoming engagement efforts, including the potential webinar series anticipated for next year. We will drop Kirsten's email into the chat momentarily so that you have that. And please, Kirsten has let us know that she's happy also to answer questions or concerns, so feel free to contact her about all things related to California halibut, not just a request to be put onto the contact list. And thank you, Kirsten, for making that option available for folks to have that dialogue with you. Okay, so the final 2020 stock assessment and the report of the peer review panel will be shared publicly, again, on OST and CDFW's websites by the end of November. And today was really an orientation to help set the stage for your continued learning as you take the time to download these reports and continue to engage in this scales management process. CDFW has continued to share updates related to the master plan implementation at the California Fish and Game Commission and Marine Resource Committee public meetings. It's my understanding that they will continue to make updates in terms of master plan implementation, and more specifically, updates related to the California halibut scales management process. So invite you to visit the Commission webpage. The link is shown on your screen, and we will drop that into the chat to view the meeting schedule and to join in those meetings. On November 10th, the next meeting, CDFW will be sharing updates from today's webinar. Next slide, please. Okay. I hear my son, my toddler, making noise in the background. I apologize. So, of course, we invite you to stay informed. I think collectively, OST and CDFW are, hopeful that you will stay informed and stay engaged in this process. So we invite you to visit the OST webpage for more information related to the peer review process, or if you have any questions about today's webinar, as they're the convener of today's webinar. And again, if you wish to access the recording of the webinar or to send that to your colleagues. We have suggested that you reach out to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and continue to check their webpage for any information or questions related to the management of the fishery itself, and to stay informed of upcoming engagement opportunities as scales management gets underway. We will drop those links into the chat. Next slide, please. Okay, so thank you so much on behalf of the California Ocean Science Trust and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We deeply appreciate your time and your contributions to today's webinar. We hope you found the webinar informative and enjoyable. Thank you so much. Please be in touch, stay safe, and continue to have a fabulous day. So thank you, everyone.